Um, okay, I'm Michael Langone. I'm the executive director of ICSA. This is my bio. I received my doctorate in counseling psych from the University of California, Santa Barbara, way back in '79. I stumbled into a career with ICSA in 1981, and I've been working in this field ever since. I founded our Cultic Studies Journal. I've been the editor of books and written articles. That's my picture in case you may have seen me at conferences and if you don't see us clearly here. Patrick Ryan is a graduate of Maharishi International University. Pat, why don't you talk about yourself? Why don't you do it?
No, go ahead and talk about me, Michael. I
All
can't
right.
see.
He's been a cult intervention specialist. He can't see because he's got bad eyes. He has been a cult intervention specialist, exit counselor since 1984. He co-founded TMX, Transcendental Meditation X, and he started our first website, presented many programs and at conferences and other things. He won the Leo J. Ryan Distinguished Service Award and a Lifetime Achievement Award from ICSA. And his websites are intervention101.com, cultmediation.com, and cultrecovery101.com. And here's his giant head. Okay, the title of this program is Leaving and Recovering from Cultic Groups and Relationships. Pat, you can see, because you're a moderator, right? You can see if someone sends a chat. Because I'm on full screen, so I don't know. So why don't you,
look.
You interrupt if there's a chat that has to be dealt with.
Okay.
And Pat will chime in and offer maybe some examples or reflections based upon his long experience as we go through the PowerPoint. Okay, the subjects that we'll explore are the concept cult and the basic questions. Why do people become members? Why do they stay in cultic groups? Why do they leave? And what recovery issues do they face when they leave? Okay, there is a dilemma. The cult phenomenon is complex and nuanced. There are many pathways to the common destinations of joining, staying, leaving, and recovery. What I'm saying there is everybody is different, and we should refrain from imposing a theoretical model on human beings, each of whom is unique. So there are many reasons why people join, why they stay, why they leave, and what they deal with when they recover. And we try to generalize as best we can, but we should be aware that generalization.
I think that it might be good to mention a few of the reasons why people join, they stay, and they leave.
If
this is a good time. If this is a good time.
No, because it's in the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay. You know, we want simple models to understand the complex and varied phenomenon. Okay, and one of my pet peeves is that people use theories as though they're realities and they impose their theories on the phenomena. So Lifton, for example, is very popular. So one takes Lifton's 8 points and imposes it on a particular cult and looks for examples of the 8 points. I don't think that's particularly useful. It's imposing the model on the phenomenon rather than letting the phenomenon, which in the case of an individual is an individual person's experience, determine how you analyze it. Okay, the concept cult. I approach cult from the standpoint of power. Lord Acton in the 19th century famously said, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Whenever there is a power differential in a relationship, there is a risk that power will be abused and people will be hurt. Typical examples are parent-child, the most typical, teacher-student, clergy-parishioner, psychotherapist-client. Now, related to that is the concept of undue influence, which really refers to those special relationships where there is an implied or even an explicit trust between a weaker party and a stronger party. So, for example, a stockbroker has a fiduciary relationship to his clients. He is expected to abide by certain ethical guidelines. The same is true of a psychotherapist. The same is true of a clergyman. And in cultic situations, what you often see are people violating this implied trust of a special relationship. The guru with the follower, for example. In new groups, it's not surprising that they don't have any accountability. Most mainstream religious organizations, like churches, are accountable to some kind of denominational structure. So even denominations like the Southern Baptists, which give a lot of leeway to the individual pastor, still have some kind of denominational structure. The risk of power being abused becomes especially difficult in a group where it's leader-centered, where there are intense emotions and demanding of time. Those are some of the characteristics we see in cultic groups. Okay, some power differentials may emphasize coercion, child abuse, physical spouse abuse, or the guerrilla pimps that sex trafficking experts talk about. These are the pimps that use physical threats to control the women and girls under them. Some emphasize deception and manipulation and induce dependency. The kinds of abuses we usually see in cults, whether psychotherapy, religious, or otherwise, will emphasize deception and manipulation rather than overt coercion. In the sex trafficking field, they talk about Romeo pimps who essentially seduce the girls that they get to work for them. All of these dynamics of influence and control can be found in cults. Do we have any questions coming in from the Q&A?
Not at this point. I've answered them all.
Okay. All right. How about the numbers on the attendees? Sorry for interrupting.
31.
Have we had more people come in? Or?
Yes, we're at 31.
Oh, we're at 31. Okay. All right. Hopefully you can all hear. Unfortunately, for those who came in late, the hand raising function, which allows you to raise your hand electronically and speak, does not seem to be working. And we'll have to try to find out why from Blue Jeans after this test event. Okay, what's distinctive about the concept cult? In practice, the term is often applied to a wide range of abusive influence situations. Just because someone calls a group a cult doesn't mean it's just like another group that's called a cult. There are great differences in intensity and the pervasiveness of the manipulation, the level and degree of harm, etc. One thing that sets the concept cult apart is an emphasis on identity change. If you're in the military, you're in an authoritarian environment. Your sergeant says, go, and you go. You're expected to obey. But you're not expected to love your sergeant. You're just expected to comply. In a cult, there is an emphasis not only on compliance or obedience, but also to believe. Now, Afshi and Singer, I'm going to go out of I'm going to go out of the full screen view to show you Afshi and Singer, one of their seminal papers from 1986 was attacks on peripheral versus central elements of self. And they distinguished between Korean War era brainwashing and cults by proposing that in cults there is an emphasis on changing core elements of the self. That the Korean era brainwashing was more concerned with compliance, with getting soldiers to confess to crimes. Okay, but cults were actually trying to change identity. And you can find this and other articles I may refer to on the ICSA website Oops, I got to go here because Pat's picture is in the way. Under articles, click on that, and you would go down to a taxon and you could click on it. And any other article that I may mention in this talk, you can find there. Okay, so what's distinctive about the concept cult? Um, the identity change. In literature, Orwell's 1984 is a wonderful example of that. The protagonist, I forget his name, could have simply been put up against the wall as Stalin used to do with people he didn't like and shot in the head. That would have been the end of him. But in this society, they want everyone to be a believer. And the last part of the book essentially traces the brainwashing of the protagonist until the final sentence in the book is, I love Big Brother. Big Brother was the dictator. Okay, so the goal is not just compliance. The goal is belief, conviction, devotion. In a true blue, full-blown cult, that is what's different from just an ordinary authoritarian situation, such as the military. A psychologist, Flavel Yakeley, did an interesting study about 20, 25 years ago where he had members of cults complete a personality test. And they completed it as they think they would have completed it 5 years previously, as they feel now, and as they think they would complete it 5 years in the future. And what he found, which was very interesting, across a variety of different cults, was a striking convergence in the future version toward the personality of the leader. So in a sense, what Yakeley was finding was a tendency within these groups to change the personalities at a core level, to change the identities of people to fit a certain format. Okay, why do people become members of cults? First of all, some are born into cultic groups or brought into them by their parents. And these have been called second generation adults or sometimes multi-generation because some of them may be the third or fourth generation born into cults. They have their special considerations with this subpopulation. Adults who become members initially believe that the group is good, but if they leave, they later see it as bad. That may be because they were deceived, because a good group goes bad, or other reasons. The late Paul Martin, who founded the Wellspring Retreat and Resource Center, for example, was a member of the Great Commission. And he told me once that he believed that it was an honest group that was trying to do good things when it was first formed, but the power that the leadership had became intoxicating, and then it became more and more abusive as time went on. Larry
Michael,
Pyle, yeah.
I just want to go back to this, what you were talking about in terms of no one joins a group intentionally.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's completely accurate because in doing interventions for 34 years, there are people that I have counseled who intentionally joined a group because they wanted something that the group offered. It wouldn't be something that I wanted, but it was something that they wanted.
Yeah,
And
I agree, and I give the example later of someone who reads a book and likes it and looks up the group. But I think what people mean when they say nobody intentionally joins a cult, it's not they intentionally join a group, they intentionally join a cult, is they don't join what they will later see. So what they are joining seems benevolent. It's something that provides things that they want. So they are intentionally joining a group, but they later find out that it isn't what they thought it was, and that is what they're referring to. If they knew what it was going to be, they would not have joined. Okay, so now vulnerability is something that can make people particularly vulnerable to recruitment or to joining for other reasons. And what clinically, what people have found is most people who join cults are relatively normal. There's some research that indicates that the percentage of psychological disorders might be somewhat higher among cult joiners than the general population, but if it is, it isn't much higher. And it's,
We
yeah,
have a
go ahead.
question, Michael.
Yeah.
Somebody from Montreal asked, do we think that the most profound change is related to the change in the fundamental values of the individual?
I think if the conversion is complete and full, yeah, that is the essence of the deep conversion, what Ashi and Singh call the core elements of the self get changed in a full cult conversion. Now, not all cult conversions are necessarily that deep. You may find different people who have different levels of um, connection to the group. Jack Clark, the psychiatrist who first got me into this, made the clinical observation that, in his opinion, often it was the most intelligent, thoughtful people who wound up becoming most damaged because they really bought into the ideology and the practices of the group. They integrated it because of their thoughtfulness and intelligence. Other people might have had more of a superficial joining, sort of like groupies, and they might not have been as damaged. I know in my clinical experience, I've seen both cases. I've seen people who were in cultic groups, sometimes groups that would be deemed pretty harmful, who maintained a level of internal independence simply because they never attached themselves that passionately or sincerely to the group, whereas others did. And when they leave, the sense of betrayal is much greater for them.
That's an important
Okay.
point.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it gets back to the point we try to emphasize again and again, that everybody's going to be different. Now, clinically, it seems that certain personality traits may make some people more likely to be recruited or to be held into a group. If you tend to be dependent, you're unassertive, you're gullible, you're naive, you have low self-esteem, all of these kinds of personality weaknesses can be exploited by an unethical manipulator to bring you in closer. The same process will occur in normal life, uh, in that people who are decent and care about other people will not react to someone with low self-esteem by trying to manipulate them. They may do the opposite. They may try to boost their self-esteem. They may try to be supportive.
So we have a comment from someone, Michael,
Yeah.
that says there's some research and therapists who say that people always have an authentic part that exists within them. How does this relate with the full conversion that you just mentioned? And they go on to say that they believe that Julie Jenkins and Steve Hassan talk about the authentic part. I just want to give that as a context for the question.
Yeah, it's a good point. And when I say full conversion, I'm not really implying 100% absolute, because there is a sort of core element in the self that even in the most powerful environments remains intact, or at
Mm-hmm.
least we think we do. Certainly for those who come out, it remains intact. What we don't know is whether for those who never come out, if they still have that core element or not. I don't see why it wouldn't be there. I mean, if you believe in some sense of core human dignity and human nature, then it's not unreasonable to think that everybody, including the person who's been in a destructive group for 60 years, has some little hidden piece of himself way down deep
But
that
doesn't
different.
someone always have themselves? Aren't you always yourself? You might, when you have a relationship with somebody, you're yourself and that in that relationship. When you have you're yourself and with in a bad boss or bad job situation, you're still yourself. You might suppress parts of your personality, but aren't you always you?
Well, yeah, now we get into a philosophical discussion about what is the self. And I think what the questioner was referring to is the notion that there is an independent part of the self. I think what Marion Bowery called the creative self,
Hmm.
deep down, that maintains a level of independence even in a very powerful environment. That certainly seems to be the case for people who leave.
Hmm.
I'm just constitutionally reluctant to make absolute statements and say that every single one of the millions of people potentially who were in cults had that. They may have. I mean, I'm not opposed to the idea, but that's an empirical question, and I don't know that we can answer it. Certainly, though, people who come out have it, but it could be the case that part of the reason why person A comes out and person B doesn't come out is that person A had a stronger core, kind of that kernel of independence hidden underneath all of the manipulated self from the group. We just don't know.
So the question now someone is asking is, but how about SGAs, the people who were born and raised? They never developed a self, or were developed within the cult.
Yeah, the SGAs are a different situation because SGA's personality is shaped by the cult environment. And depending upon how twisted that environment will be, their personality is going to be affected by it. Now, a lot of SGAs who have come out of groups will really relate to the concept of that core inner
Hmm.
piece of independence. Uh, and they will talk about how the kids, when they were kids, they would sort of support each other secretly. It was, and this manifests later as adults when they come out, in that there's still a sense of us and them, and a tendency to relate with other SGAs. Uh, Joyce Martella, who
Hmm.
is an SGA and completed a dissertation a year or two ago, has an interesting metaphor for SGAs, an image, and she actually uses it on her business card. She has an image of a tree, and the lower part of the tree is growing up straight, and then there's a curve in the tree as though it had grown around a tree trunk that later, um, what do you call it? The tree trunk dissolved. I forget the term. And then it continues growing straight again. And she uses that image to express her opinion that SGAs, because of the destructive environment they grow up in, experience a certain twisting in their development, but they have the capacity to recover from that and then grow straight again. So it's a tree that is straight, then there's a curve, a hook, and then it grows straight again. And that environment is a distorting environment, but because maybe there is such a thing as human nature, because there is this core sense of self, even SGAs growing up in terrible environments can survive, recover, and thrive. There's a whole area of research and psychology on what used to be called the invulnerables, which are children who grow up in the most terrible environments. And according to all the theories of personality development, they should be a mess, but they're not. And there's some assets that they have as individuals that enable them to not only survive these environments, but leave them and thrive
There's
elsewhere.
another question here, Michael. PK asks, is this why a friend who got out of the cult that this person was in went back in?
Well, I think there is, as with joining and leaving, there are many reasons why someone will leave. There are many reasons why someone will go back in. I would say the individual case would have to be analyzed. Sometimes people will return to the group because the anxiety and depression and that they feel in the mainstream world outweighs whatever unhappiness they may have had in the group. Um,
They
I've
also
used yeah, go ahead.
people miss that sense of like being exclusive or special.
Yeah, that might be something too. Um,
Uh, and if we talk about certain groups, some people, groups help them become sober, and when they left the group, they're no longer sober, and they go back to groups because it gives a context or a place for them to maintain sobriety. For some people,
yeah, I mean, you can look upon it as kind of a cost-benefit calculus that the individual makes. The cost of being in a highly controlling group is you sacrifice a certain amount of your independence and you're subservient to the leadership to the group. But you get certain benefits from it. The military is an authoritarian structure. You sacrifice a certain amount of independence and autonomy when you join the military or you join a monastic order. That you make a choice to do that and you choose it because you have made a decision that you think the benefits outweigh the cost. You may later come to regret that decision, as happens with some people who join the military or join monastic groups and they want out. Um, but at the time you made the decision, you were weighing the costs and benefits. That raises the issue of informed consent, which is a concept that's often used to describe cults. That in a manipulative, deceitful cultic situation, people will make choices, but they're not really informed because information is withheld from them, or they're given false information, or emotions are manipulated in order to direct them towards certain choices. So
there's
that,
somebody has a
yeah.
comment on this, what you just said. They said that one's natural drive, their will, their impulse to thrive, can be co opted into a cultic organization with varying degrees of success. But the drive to thrive is present regardless of the context.
Yeah, I think for the vast large majority of people, that's true. But there are people who lose that. I mean, certainly when someone kills himself, you might question whether or not the drive to thrive is strong. It may still be there, but it may be overwhelmed by other factors that lead to a self-destructive behavior that leads to him jumping off of a roof. Um, but for the most part, I would agree that there is something to the concept of human nature, and people do, at their core, want to be independent, want to make choices for themselves, want to better themselves. At
So,
their core, I think most people care about other people. Uh,
So
Cults,
another person just said
yeah,
they just want to add that people who go back or join another cult often is due to a lack of skill to function on the outside of the authoritarian structure, which to me highlights the importance of therapy. People need to learn how to function independently of authoritarian groups.
yeah, yeah. Do you want to comment on any of these, Pat?
No,
Feel free.
I'm sort of trying to
Okay,
manage all these questions that are
okay,
coming in.
all right.
I'm not
Uh,
shy, you know.
yeah, I mean that made me think of years ago got calls from two people who had been in the Children of God. They were maybe 20 years old. They had come out. They had been sexually abused. And both of them said that the main problem they had was their lack of education. they could kind of bottle up the sexual abuse and, bury it and deal with it. But what they could not do is they couldn't function because
Hmm.
they had been roaming around the world with the group, and they never got an education, so they had no skills and they couldn't support themselves. So someone in that kind of situation might be tempted to go back into the group as the lesser of two evils. Or sometimes the group may have some positive qualities. They may have friends, family, they may have emotional attachments to people, and they go back in because they're making a decision that this is better for them than what they're experiencing outside. Sometimes people go back and forth several times, before they finally settle on one or the other.
This reminds me of a intervention I once did with somebody in a Eastern group, and at the end of the intervention, they asked if they could come live with me, and I said no, and I said why? They said because all I have to do to live in this group is I have to wash dishes for 2 hours a day, and the rest of the time I get to play music, and that's really what I like to do is play music. So I have a roof over my head, and I get to play music, but I don't believe anything they say.
Yeah. Yeah, now that's an interesting example of someone who's maintained a level of independence even in a powerful environment. And in a sense, he's using the environment that wants to use him. Uh, Anna, turn off the ringer, please. Okay, so
One more comment about that someone just brought in is that why this friend that left the cult went back in, and that they never had therapy that was around the group, which was a church.
yeah, it could have been therapy. If it was competent therapy, might have helped him to function better outside the group, and he might not have gone back in. Uh, the research that's been done, at least within the populations that come within the ICSA network, indicates that most of the ex-members uh, have serious difficulties to deal with. And, at least mental health professionals would say that probably most of them could definitely benefit from therapy.
We have a comment that this is also like the cult hopper that hasn't been trained in critical thinking
Yeah,
that you often see in more new age type groups where someone goes from one type of healing therapy to another one. It works for a while, and then they're no longer doing, I'm making this up, aura balancing. Now they're doing chakra therapy. And if it's not chakra therapy, it's moved to a different type. It's a
yeah,
constantly moving.
yeah. And
And
Steve Eichel actually wrote a paper on that years ago on cult hopping in the New Age. What I
it also,
have, what I
it
have,
also that's okay.
Go ahead. Oh,
No, it also relates to what Freud talked about when he was using studying hypnosis, and he said that when you use direct suggestion to make a symptom go away, it might go away, but it would possibly come back in a different guise. And so you see that with people in certain types of groups, especially healing therapy groups, that the group that they go to, whatever the method is used, maybe works for somebody for a while, and then they know it no longer works, and they go to a different group. But the overall ideas have never been examined. I think that's what this person about is addressing with the idea of cult hopping.
well, there's another factor to cult hopping which relates to worldviews.
Hmm.
And the New Age is a worldview that's sort of quasi-magical. It looks for techniques to achieve happiness. Um, it will tend to uh, favor Eastern kinds of views or large group awareness trainings. So someone who has imbibed a New Age worldview may hop from one New Age group to another because he still has that New Age worldview, which I've sometimes sarcastically called in search of the perfect gimmick. And gimmick A didn't work, so he tries something else. So S didn't work, so he tries LifeSpring. That doesn't work, so he tries rebirthing therapy. and he hops from one to the other. And he's looking for a, a set of techniques that will create a happiness in him that either eludes him or
Mhm.
perhaps that is so unrealistic a goal. Like maybe what he wants is to be high forever and ever and ever, have that high experience and it never ends. And, the human condition is such that you're just not going to get that, unless someone comes up with some chemical someday,
So,
so big
uh,
deal.
Elisa says that these are all really good points that affect the decision, the company, a sense of purpose, adjusting to a new lifestyle, and the fact that it's a complete break often is something important to consider, which increases the difficulty of the decision and adjustment.
Yeah, certainly the complete break theme is an important one because for the person leaving a group, it often is a complete break. If you devoted 20 years of your life to a church and all your friends are in that church and you've disconnected from other friends or you've moved away from where you grew up and where you have friends and family, and your work has been with the church, to leave that church is a complete break, especially if it's one that practices shunning and they're not going to have anything to do with you when you leave. That is a tough thing. And someone making that kind of decision, I think, would be advised to get into some kind of professional therapy, and even more than that, try to get some kind of support group. That
So
is where a lot of ex-member forums and so on that are on the web can be very helpful to people, so they can talk to others who have had similar experiences, and can at least, at minimum, say, yeah, I understand what you're talking about.
So we have another comment that one way I discovered to explain what a cult is to compare the cult to a computer program or a virus that would gradually be implemented on my computer until the new program takes control of the program that existed before. What's your opinion on this comparison?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting metaphor. There's certainly some truth to it, that a cult is a deceptive thing like a computer virus is. People are not aware of everything that's going on, and at some point it has control over them. And, obviously they weren't aware, otherwise they wouldn't have let it take control. That's the essence of deception. We don't consciously allow ourselves to be deceived. Because if we know what's going on, we're not deceived. The essence of deception is you don't know what's happening. Okay, let me get back to the outline. That was a good question.
There's-
Okay, I was talking about the vulnerability, the personality traits, developmental stresses, young adults, romance, career stresses, situational stresses, loss, bereavement. All of these things can make someone open to changing their life path. If everything's going well for you, you're happy, you've got relationships, you've got a satisfying job, chances are you'll be less likely to make a major change in your life. And I say less likely because even those people can be seduced into a cultic situation, depending upon a lot of factors, one of the most important of which is the deceptive seductiveness of the group.
On
Now,
this point, we have if jumping in, somebody just said, chasing this experience from the peak to the valleys and how the group labels these barriers in a way as being your impurity. And the means for overcoming that can only be achieved through the perfected one's guidance.
that's a good point, which a lot of ex-members have made, which is the group is always right and the member is always wrong, is always deficient. Um, so that if the group says that if you practice this meditation technique, you will be happy, and you practice the meditation technique and you're not happy, well, obviously you did not practice it correctly. Otherwise, you would be happy. There's a non-falsifiability to some of the fundamental assumptions that undergird cultic groups. They cannot be falsified because by definition they are correct. This is part of the reason why I think a lot of groups have to have boundaries to close themselves off from the outside world, because they are advocating belief systems that really do not hold water. They can't withstand critical scrutiny. So the leaders of the groups have to control information, control relationships, control the contact members have with the outside world, so that they are not, so they don't question the group. Charlene Edge wrote a book on her experience in the Way International. I should remember the title of it, but you could find it on Amazon. EDGE is her last name. She worked in the Way's research arm, where she was essentially writing the books, the Bible analyses, and so on. Because of her job, she was exposed to other theological frameworks, to other Bibles. She read the Greek, the original Greek, and she came to see that what the leader, Victor Paul Wierwille, was teaching was just plain false. But she was in an especially peculiar position. Most of the members of the group would never have been exposed to the information that she was exposed to. So Wierwille was in the kind of paradoxical situation of needing people to research things so that he could continue to put forth his sophistry. But in the process of researching things, at least some of them began to question the sophistry itself.
So the book is called Undertow: My Escape from the Fundamentalism and the Cult Control of the Way International.
Okay, good. Thank
And
you.
we have another comment that, based upon what you're saying, and the person says that they struggle with the term cult. It has a lot of negative connotations and it appears to be over-applied. Also, most lay people don't understand what it really means. I prefer terms such as authoritarian groups, high control groups, high demand groups. What's your thought on this?
Yeah. I mean, we've wrestled with terms for 40 years, ever since the organization was founded. And the problem is no one term is going to be um, accepted by everybody. So some people will relate to the term cult, others don't. When we changed our name, for example, in 2004, we had several dozen people engaged in several months of correspondence and phone calls and meetings. And some of us, myself included, did not want the term cult in the name of the new organization. Our old name had been American Family Foundation. But the majority wanted some connection with cult, despite its limitations. Now, what we've done in a practical sense to try to deal with the point that the questioner makes is to try to have different terms for different purposes. So, for instance, we just ran a conference in Hartford last month on spiritual abuse recovery. Spiritual abuse is a term that many people will relate to, especially those coming out of Christian groups, because they have been taught that cult is a theological concept. The cult is a heretical group. And if the group they came out of was at least more or less orthodox in its theology, then it can't be a cult. But they feel abused and battered and misused and mistreated. So they know something bad was going on, and they relate to the term spiritual abuse. Back in the 1990s, Bill Chambers and I did a research study where we asked 101 former cult members from a large variety of different groups to rate terms on what they thought ex-members would relate to. And the terms that got the highest kinds of ratings were terms like psychological abuse, spiritual rape. Uh, Lower on the list were terms like cult and brainwashing. The parents related to cult and brainwashing, and I think the reason why is the ex-members were relating to what they experienced, or terms that reflected what they experienced, whereas the parents were trying to understand the puzzling phenomenon, and they needed abstract terms to try to give meaning to something that they were struggling to understand. But yeah, go ahead, Pat.
This relates in some way to, I think we did a workshop at the University of Madrid with ex-members, and we asked there was maybe 20, 30 people in the workshop, was the term cult necessary to describe their experience, or is it what Dr. Lifton would call a thought-terminating cliche? And it was sort of interesting how the room divided. Those who had more recently left their groups, it was something that helped coalesce that they could coalesce around. It helped them define or their experience. They met other people who had the same type of ideas. The people who were out of their groups for long periods of times saw it in maybe a different way, maybe possibly more nuanced. They saw the vulnerabilities that they had, the level of participation they had, and it wasn't as meaningful a term, at least
That's a
in
good
that workshop.
that's a good point. The preferred term may vary depending upon one stage in the recovery process.
Right.
So I guess the long and short of it is no one term is going to be applicable in all situations for all people. And the important thing is that you define your terms and you not be arrogant about your terms. You recognize that there's a mushiness to it, and you don't try to impose a false kind of precision that simply isn't there. Okay, the first encounter that people have. Um, I like to say never underestimate bad luck. And we're talking now about people who join groups. Obviously, those who are born and raised in a group don't have a first encounter. Their first encounter is being born. But for those who join, um, they may be approached on the street, and there are people who have joined through street encounters. That used to happen more often in the early days of this field when the Unification Church was just dominant as a cult group because they specialized in street encounters. But most groups don't. The research that exists indicates most people join through friendship networks. They have a friend who's in a group and he or she says, "This is really wonderful. You should come. You should try this." As Pat mentioned, some people will find out about a group and they will approach the group themselves. They may be curious, or they may have read things about it, or they saw a video, or whatever. Some are approached on college campuses. In the late 80s, there was a whole spate of recruitments of the Boston Church of Christ movement on college campuses. In Boston, chaplains from about 30 or 40 universities had special meetings just to discuss the problem the Boston Church of Christ was causing on their campuses because they were recruiting so many kids. They would go into the dormitories and sort of look for vulnerable freshmen and persuade them to come to their Bible study, and then they would hit them with the full panoply of love bombing, manipulation, etc., and they'd lead them through a series of stages. They would become part of the Boston movement. So there are a variety of reasons why people may first approach a group or respond to a contact. Now, after that first encounter, then you've got how does the personality match with the group? Not everybody is going to respond to every group. Some people would never, ever, ever respond to a Christian proselytizer. Some people would never, ever, ever respond to someone peddling a guru group. because of their background and the values that they have and the beliefs that they hold, the worldview that they hold. If you're following a Christian worldview, you may not be open to someone peddling an Eastern group, but if you adhere to a New Age or Eastern worldview, you might, but you won't be open to the Christian. So you have a lot of variation in that interaction of personality and group. And there's also the concept of inner experiences.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of groups, there are powerful internal experiences that really constitute a quantum jump in conviction. Paul Martin used to talk about the buzz in
Mm-hmm.
Christian groups, getting everyone excited. Pat has encountered this a lot, and I actually have a paper that's, if I can go out of this, inner experience
In conversion.
and conversion. I've got it in here. Inner experience. Oh, Jesus, I closed it. It's inner experience and conversion. And it was largely written as a result of conversations I had with Pat. Um, because in Eastern groups, the inner experience is very important. And maybe, Pat, you might talk some about that.
Well, I mean, when we talk about inner experiences, we're talking often about feeling states, but in some cases it can be a visual hallucination, an auditory hallucination. Uh, in some way, it's like falling in love. It's not something that's always rational. So depending upon a groups have predicted experiences that people will have. So, for example, in some Eastern groups, particularly those come out of the tradition called Vaishnavism, they're taught that, and we're talking millions of people that have these beliefs, that God comes back to Earth on a cycle. And every time God returns, his skin has a slightly different color. And in this age that we live in now, called Kali Yuga, God comes back with a golden hued skin. And so, a colleague of mine, having come from studying Eastern philosophy, went to hear a guru speak, and all of a sudden, the room seemed to appear golden light, and the man started appearing golden. Now, objectively, I think if we put a camera, he wasn't golden, but the person who had this experience had it inside themselves. And it verified for them that this person must be the return of God of this age. So those internal experiences can be quite powerful. And it's the one who interprets the experience for you that really sort of runs your show.
Um, I'm surprised we don't have comments or questions on that. Do we have
Well, we have
anything?
one just back for on the word cult that I hate to jump off of it, but I think they would like it's talked about. They said that I personally feel that the word cult swallows my experience. I get swallowed with it into a category of freak against my true feelings of myself. And then they go on to say that on a slightly different subject, I'm sorry we're getting behind in these, is thanks, whether it is included or not is fine. Oh, never mind. That's okay. That's it. That was
Okay.
just,
Yeah, I mean, if you don't like the word cult, don't use it. You
yeah.
know, there's good reason not to. I mean, you're certainly not alone in not liking that term. And I don't claim that it is the term. It's just, of all the terms, it seems to be the one that more people relate to, but not all
Yep.
people by any means.
Someone is asking now, is cult hopping an addiction to love bombing and those initial powerful experiences?
Well, I'm
Addiction's
not
a
sure.
strong word.
Yeah, addiction is a strong word, and it connotes some kind of biological process. And it is possible, some people have speculated about biological, neurological concomitants of various experiences people have in cults. So it's possible, I wouldn't jump to belief. I would consider it a hypothesis that's not unreasonable, but there could be other explanations that don't require addiction.
Well,
From my
also,
standpoint. Yeah, go ahead,
also
Pat.
that don't involve love bombing. Because you could go from I'm going to use the Eastern ideas. You could go from guru to guru to guru because you want to have some kind of internal world view, some kind of internal experience, a sense of being part of the universe, and it's inside yourself. And the guru and the group could not be. They could be very unpleasant, and there could be real lack of love bombing, but the desire to have that sort of sense of what might be called enlightenment or liberation is so strong that you'll put up with it. So I think that people can go to group because they want to have this initial experience again, but it doesn't always come about by love bombing.
Yeah, I would be more inclined to think in terms of worldviews rather than addiction. If you still adhere to an Eastern worldview, which means A, you believe that you are God and that some way, if you can follow the correct pathway, you will recognize and become aware of your divinity, your oneness with God. B, there are gurus, there are teachers who can help lead you to that state. C, that you experience reincarnation, and that if you find the right teacher, you may be able to end the cycle of births and deaths because you found the right technique, so to speak. If you still believe in those assumptions, you believe in essentially an Eastern Guru worldview, and you may have a bad experience with Guru A, but if you still adhere to that worldview, you may look to Guru B and you may say, well, Guru A was an SOB, so I'm putting him behind me, but I still believe that there's someone out there who is an authentic teacher. But the minute you abandon those assumptions and say you arrive at the conclusion that this is all nonsense, I don't believe in reincarnation, I don't think I am God, and I don't think that there are a set of techniques that can lead me to understand that, now you have no motivation for going to another guru. But if you suddenly experience a Christian conversion and you now feel that you're a Christian and you have adopted Christian or Jewish or Muslim or whatever assumptions about life, you may now move in a different direction to try to deal with whatever inner unhappiness you have.
Well,
If
someone
you have, yeah,
Someone has some issues with, I think, the example I brought up, that even calling this time that we live in as Kali Yuga is subjective, and they question giving legitimacy to the term in a group like this discussion. And then they went on to say, "Are you stating that these inner experiences like golden hue are just subjective suggestibility?"
well, do you want to answer that?
Well, I mean, I think that
Golden Yu?
suggestibility could be an explanation. I can't tell someone what brought about their experience, but that's a possibility. Context does create experience, and if the context is of golden hue, um, you tend to possibly have that experience. Jolly West once gave an example. Dr. Jolly and West, he's deceased. That these are similar to near-death experiences. Christian children do not experience Shiva when they have a near-death experience. Catholic kids, maybe experience the Virgin Mary. Buddhist kids don't experience a Catholic saint appearing. They're context dependent. And I think that I do believe that many of these experiences are context dependent. Suggestibility may be not the word I would use.
How you evaluate these experiences is partly a function of your own philosophy of life. At first, as an aside, we were not advocating the Kali Yuga, that we're saying this is the Kali Yuga, that we're believing in it. Some people believe in it, but
Yeah,
I don't.
yeah,
I don't think Pat does.
no.
But as far as the experience, if you are a believer in some kind of transcendental order, whether it's Christian, Eastern, Muslim, or whatever, your evaluation of these inner power experiences that may lead to conversion might be different from the evaluation of someone who is coming from a secular atheistic perspective. The atheist is going to assume that there's some kind of natural neurological explanation for it. Whereas the person who is coming from a religious standpoint might acknowledge that there may be some objective reality in some of these experiences. In Christianity, for example, there is the concept of discernment, of discerning the authentic from the inauthentic. Okay, the atheist would say, well, it's all inauthentic, it's all illusion. And, we don't get into the philosophical debates about that. I mean, we have people from all perspectives within the ICSA network. We've got, atheists to firm believers in all, pretty much all the major religions and even some unusual religions. The common denominator, I think, that brings people together is a recognition that there are certain methods of influencing people that are unethical and that should not be used. And that if you're going to respect the autonomy and the identity of individual human beings, you will not use deceit, guilt manipulation, emotional manipulation, and all kinds of other social pressures in order to move him or her to a point where you want him to go. It's a question of respect. And you can be an atheist, you can be a fundamentalist Christian, you can be a liberal Christian, you can be a Jew, you can be a Muslim, you can be a Buddhist, you can be any one of a number of religious philosophical, be in a number of religious philosophical belief systems and still recognize that the ethics of social influence are significant and that human beings should be respected. Okay.
I just want to respect. There's a lot of questions and comments coming in, but I don't know that I'm going to be able to get to every one of these as Michael goes through this presentation. We're about 12 questions behind at this point, Michael.
Okay. Well, we've got almost an hour, so we're actually doing pretty well.
Okay.
This is odd for me because I'm used to having an audience where I actually see the people I'm talking to. So it's kind of an odd experience to know that there are so many people out there listening that I can't see you and I can't communicate other than through this Q&A. It would have been much better had we had the talk function working, but we will look into that.
We will do that the next.
Yeah, I will often make a distinction between what I categorize as outer-generated versus inner-generated conversion. And what I'm referring to is the degree to which the religious conversion that someone has is really emanating from within himself, okay? That it reflects his experience in life, his deliberations about life, his emotions, his feelings, versus an outer-generated, which is where you've got the external pressures, the conformity pressures, the deceit, the manipulation, and that, I think the outer-generated conversions will tend to be less enduring because they often need the social pressure to sustain itself. That's why in the early days where the Moonies, who specialized in this kind of outer-generated conversion, a lot of Moonies would leave when they were just out of the environment. It's as though once all of those social pressures were gone, they were able to begin to think. And the inner part of themselves came forward and caused them to reevaluate their Mooney commitment. I think, Pat, wasn't it Steve Hassan who was in an auto accident and he was in the hospital for a while, and that's where his own kind of deconversion from the Moonies began.
There's a comment here that from Kent that regarding these inner experiences, we do well to recall that when people get into an altered state, memory, fantasy, and the present room level of information all come into the person as equally real.
Yeah, I mean, that's
And
why the internal that's why those experiences are so powerful in shaping belief and changing beliefs because they do seem real. It's like the near death experience that people report. They say it was as real as being awake. Okay, and then if you haven't had the experience, you can't really judge uh, what the person actually experienced. You just have to kind of take them at their word. So they have a powerful impact. But what we see in cults is the capacity to manipulate, in a sense, to engineer, to induce these kinds of experiences. So, for instance, if you are um, isolated for long periods of time, you're meditating hour after hour after hour, that can put you in a susceptible kind of state. And you may be more likely to have experience that have been suggested to you through the teachings of the group. And so you have to ask, is it really an inner-generated experience, or is it an experience that if not outer-generated, at least is given a good push from outside? So,
um,
it gets subtle.
one of the participants would like to know that how do we compare the common belief that a Catholic priest is God's representative in the belief, and the belief that a guru is a channel for the divine. Now we're getting into, I think, theological issues, maybe.
Yeah, and I correct me if I'm wrong, Pat, but I think in the Hindu tradition, the guru, who was an avatar of the age, is God incarnate. He's aware of his godhood.
Well,
Um,
I think that you
and
have
that's very
that's
different from a priest who really, is endowed with the capacity to, in a sense, um, relay grace, as I understand it. But
also when we're talking using
probably
the word
shut my mouth because I don't really know what I'm saying.
when you're talking about guru, we're talking about a term that is interpreted in the East in many, many different ways. So there are certainly those who see the guru in an Eastern sense as God incarnate, and then there's those who don't. So I think we'd have to look at the particular tradition and how it views God or the
Yeah,
guru.
yeah. Yeah,
But
I think you're right. That's more of a theological question we're not equipped to deal with.
but there is a standard line, at least in Advaita, that the guru in Sanskrit is Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Deva, Maheshvara. Guru is God, the creator. Guru is the maintainer. Guru is God. He is everything. So from a Western view, we might think that for those people who have that idea, that they think the guru is God. But in some Eastern traditions, everything is God. The chair is God, the rock is God, the ant that just walked by is God. So the guru and the rock aren't really much different. It's all God. But then these are things that actually become, these are theological questions.
Yeah, and Christianity and Judaism and Islam are very different in that God is separate from creation, but he's also immanent in creation. But you are not God. It's like in Christian mysticism, you have an experience of oneness with the deity, but you do not experience yourself as the deity, which is different in certain Hindu approaches. Okay, any other questions, Pat, that you think we should deal with before going on?
I'm trying to answer some of them on my own here. We're doing good.
Okay, why do people stay? Okay, we've alluded to some of these things. There are real benefits. I mean, it's important not to think that everything about a cult is bad. Sometimes it may be. Certainly, the people who were in Jonestown at the end, you'd have trouble finding anything good without stretching your capacity to rationalize to the limits. But for the most part, in most groups, it isn't all bad. People form real friendships. That's why when they leave a cult, They care about the people who are still in it, and they may try to get friends to come out. They have a sense of elitism, which, I would argue is a defect rather than a benefit, but it's certainly something that attracts them. In a research study I did in the early 90s, I asked people to rate their groups on about 120 different items. Ultimately, that study led to the group psychological abuse scale, which has since been developed psychometrically by Carmen Almendros and her colleagues in Spain. But of the 120 items, the item that got the highest average rating was the group considers itself to be an elite. The second highest item was dissent is not tolerated. I'll often point to those to give my shorthand description of the cultic dynamic as want to feel special, shut up and obey. And I think that characterizes a lot of cultic environments that we've heard about through conversations with former members coming out of those groups. So elitism is certainly something that's attractive. One Christian group said they were God's green berets. I think Scientology, what do they refer to people as? Raw meat or something if you're outside the group?
Yeah, the log or raw meat.
Yeah. So that elitism is something, that's in a sense a negative benefit. But there are real friendships. People do have a sense of purpose. They do learn things. People learn skills in groups. I mean, Pat, you got a degree from
Yes.
Maharishi University. You learned a lot while you were there. So those are all reasons for staying. There's also the social psychological pressures. And those pressures are not necessarily qualitatively different from the social psychological pressures we experience in normal life, but they may be quantitatively different. They may be stronger, more pervasive.
I have
Uh,
a I have a quick little list of possible reasons why people stay. The exclusiveness and being special. And we have a good friend, and he referred to being in the group as being in a prison of specialness. He enjoyed being special. Um, People stay because of the charisma of the leader. We talked about sobriety, those internal experiences, the buzz. They like the doctrines, the teachings, the relationships, which Michael has touched on. There's also fears and phobias of potentially what might happen if one is no longer connected with a group. And then there's also manipulation, and I think that's what Ben Zabaki talks about. That one of the things that when people try to leave, some of these influence techniques kick in.
yeah, and I will get to some of that in the slide coming up. Okay, and they also will stay because they're isolated from information that would contradict the group or increase internal conflict. They're indoctrinated into a belief system that fosters an us versus them attitude. Now, I find it useful sometimes to think of a cult group from the standpoint of the leader, particularly an unscrupulous, unethical leader. What is it that the leader wants? He wants people to obey and advance his or her agenda. That agenda may be as crass as just making a lot of money. It may be for sex. It may be power. It may be a combination of those things. But he wants compliance. And how does a leader get compliance? First of all, there is a strong tendency among human beings to conform. People don't like to make waves. There's Ash's famous conformity experiments, where four people, I think, would look at a set of lines and they'd have to identify which was the short line or the long line. Only one of those four was the experimental subject. The other three were collaborators with the experimenter. And the collaborators would purposely pick the wrong answer. And Ash found that a very high percentage of people would actually say that the longer line is the short line. Okay, and Many of them did so knowing that they were lying, that they thought that B was the short line, but they conformed to everyone else and said C because they didn't want to stand out. They wanted to fit in with the group. Some of them actually believed that C was shorter. They, in a sense, almost like an auto-suggestibility, convinced themselves that what they saw was what other people said they saw. So there's that sort of shows that there is kind of a built-in tendency toward conformity that unscrupulous leaders can take advantage of. Then they build on that. They don't rely only on that. And they will use whatever it takes. So if person A will respond to sweet talk, the leader will use sweet talk. If not, he may use threats or intimidation. Once a leader has enough control, he may even be able to use coercion. So there are groups where people will be locked up for infractions of the group. But also, and this is important to remember, because it emphasizes that no cultic group is 100% effective. People get kicked out of groups all the time. In the research that we did and others, it appears that maybe as much as 10% of the people in cults are kicked out of the cults. From the standpoint of the leader, this makes eminent sense. If sweet talk, threats, intimidation doesn't work, you don't want this pain to remain in your group. You want compliance. You don't want to have to deal with someone who's always challenging you or disobeying, because then he or she becomes an example to others. So you kick them out. And there's several studies where we got a similar kind of figure of 10%. Now, Jerry McDonald, who was in the Great Commission, the group that I mentioned earlier that Paul Martin had been in, did a long sociological study that I published many years ago in the Cultic Studies Journal. And he put forth an interesting concept. It's a little bit sociology, but it sort of makes common sense when you think about it. He called it a bicameral normative system. And what he really was referring to is two sets of operating principles. When everything is going as the leader wants, it's one big happy family. And this state is governed by a benign set of rules. The leader might say please to a member. Outside observers, such as sociologists doing participant observation, might come into the group, and when it's in this state, they'll say, what cult? I mean, these are just people who are pursuing their religious vision, they're working together, they have a commune, they have a lot of good feeling with each other, they adore the leader. But then you may have a situation where one of the members raises questions, expresses dissent, disobeys, or you get some kind of outside interference, as Jim Jones did when former members formed a group, I forget what they called themselves, and they started talking to the press. Okay, now when that comes in, then another set of rules kicks in. And these rules are designed to move the sheep back in the pen, get everybody complying with the party line. And these rules are not so benign. And this is where we see the kinds of reports of abuse, of people being placed in front of a group on the hot seat and excoriated, criticized terribly in front of all of their friends and so on. They're humiliated because you may have questioned the leader. Jim Jones was really had a police state going on, because what Jones did is he had a rule that you could not criticize the People's Temple or Jones, the leader. But not only did he have, and you also had a rule that if you heard anyone criticizing, you had to report him. and then that person would be brought in front of the group and humiliated. So, but what Jones did is he had um, collaborators, sort of his police state lieutenants, purposely say something critical about Jones or the People's Temple. And if the person who heard them did not report that person, the hearer would be brought in front of the group and would be put on the hot seat and castigated and humiliated. That's true police state kinds of powers. That level of control is not necessarily typical of cults, but it can occur. And it relates again to this sense of two sets of agendas. When things are going as the leader wants, the leader can sort of kick his shoes off and lie back and put on the smile and look like the holy guru who's just at peace with himself and is in touch with divinity. But when things don't go so well, then sort of the snarling comes out, and the leader becomes a Stalinist-like figure. And this raises a problem for evaluating groups, because in some groups the benign rules may operate much more often than the malignant rules. So how do you evaluate the cultishness of a group? 90% of the time it may be functioning smoothly, and you don't have any abuse going on because everybody's with the program. They're all doing what they're supposed to do. It's like a military unit where everybody's doing his job and the captain is happy. But as soon as someone departs from the group rules, then the leader has to come in to get things back into compliance.
I think there's a point that someone has brought up. A couple of people have been bringing this one up about why people stay, and they want to add that from their experience of working with ex-members, it's about around the low tolerance of ambiguity. It's easier for some people to stay in an environment that is very controlled because it's safe. It's similar to a gate fever in prisons. Prisoners get scared about the outside world, too much responsibility, are afraid what comes with that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Clark used that exact phrase many, many years ago, low tolerance to ambiguity. And some people may have that as somewhat of a character trait, and that might make them particularly vulnerable to a group. And that tolerance of ambiguity also relates to ideology. Some people are attracted to very rigid belief systems because they can't tolerate the ambiguity of a belief system that's more nuanced, that says, well, sometimes it's this way, sometimes it's that way. They want the answer, the right answer. They want the right answer for every question. If you have that kind of personality trait, you may be vulnerable to a group that is offering that kind of clarity. Okay, it may be a spurious clarity, but it may meet your psychological needs. Even if you're not that kind of personality, the manipulative climate of the group may turn you into that. In the sense that in order to adapt to the group, you have to adopt a black-white mentality toward the outside world. Otherwise, you're going to experience the wrath of the leader and of the group. I made a slide on Ben Zablocki, who is a retired sociologist from Rutgers, who's done a lot of very good work on cults. I'm going to go out of this momentarily. You'll find some of his articles. He made a website. Where is it? benzablocki.net, and you'll find some of his articles. And the one that I would recommend to people is called Exit Cost Analysis. And one of the points that Zablocki makes in this article is that people go into groups for many different reasons. There are many pathways into a group. But once you are in this powerful environment that seeks compliance and identity change, um, there are prices to leaving. And he calls these exit costs. Now, we've alluded to some of them. You leave friends behind. You go out into a world that you may not be prepared to function in. So that there are all kinds of costs to exit. And, that the cult is actually characterized more by the difficulty people have in leaving rather than the way that they enter. There's been kind of a misconception in the field that people are brainwashed into joining. There's a certain amount of truth to that for some groups. But for most people, the joining process is not necessarily as manipulative as it was in the old days with the old Mooney conversions. Zablocki also makes a distinction between what you could call your run-of-the-mill cult member and deployable agents. Deployable agents are people who have so thoroughly imbibed the belief system of the group, of the leader, that and internalize that they will do the leader's bidding even without external controls. It has become part of them. Rod Dubrow-Marshall has used the psychology of identity formation. What's the phrase he used? Where you internalize the identity of the group. And Zablocki makes the point that brainwashing or thought reform, using Lifton's term, requires resources from the leader. And the leader doesn't necessarily go to the trouble of brainwashing everybody. He doesn't necessarily need every single cult member to be a deployable agent. So you will have a whole spectrum of, let's say, identity synthesis with the cult leader. And those who are most fully have most fully imbibed the group's identity and ideology and practices may be the deployable agents. So, for instance, in the case of Jonestown, Larry Layton shot Congressman Ryan. And Jones, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he gave kind of an indirect order. It's sort of like in the play, I think it's Beckett, who will rid me of this priest? Some famous saying, something like that. So a cult leader could make that kind of statement to the average member and nothing would happen. But he may also have certain deployable agents who, in a sense, are the Green Berets of his cult, who will understand and will respond. Okay, and the point I'm making is not to oversimplify cult environments by assuming that because Lifton's model of 8 points, of 8 themes, applies to a lot of groups, that it necessarily applies and applies completely to every single cult. Within the cult, there will be variation. Among members of the cult, there will be variation. And we should respect that variation. Respecting that variation becomes especially important in processes like exit counseling. You cannot use a cookie cutter model. And Pat, maybe you might comment some on that. The need to personalize, to make an individual analysis for each case.
Yes, I mean, and that's one of the things that hold on one second. We're having a.
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry, we got a little cross sounds here. That's when we do work with families, we really do an analysis of each individual case and the uniqueness of it, because what is the thing that has affected one or held one individual in to a group is very different from the next person in the same group.
Right, and the relationships of the family members may be very different with the person who's in the group. And you may employ one family member to play one role and another family member to play another role. Um, it gets complicated. There's no simple solution. It's like when parents, call and they're looking for help because they're concerned about a loved one in a group. They often want a set of instructions, like something that comes with your telephone. Do number one, number two, number three, and that's going to get your kid out. And it just doesn't work like that. I will often say to parents, the only thing I can guarantee you is uncertainty and anxiety because there are too many unknowns. And I cannot give you the pathway, the roadmap to get your loved one out of a cult without knowing a whole lot. And whatever strategy I or an exit counselor like Pat might come up with is always going to be a provisional strategy. It's always subject to revision because you're constantly getting information that you didn't have before, and that information may cause you to reevaluate the strategy that you're on. Okay, why do people leave? Okay, and this slide indirectly touches on the earlier questions about that inner core. Is there something, to human nature for those people who were born or raised in a group? Is there some deep sense of self that has an independence and autonomy regardless of the oppressiveness and the level of control in the group, and that there will be some kind of rebellion, even if it's a secret, private rebellion that goes on? The pressure to change identity, especially if it's an outer-generated conversion, can cause stress, especially when the group identity differs considerably from the existing identity. For instance, you're an introvert and you've been recruited into a group that wants everyone to be extroverts. It may be tough for you. You may try the best you can while you're still under the sway of the group's belief system, but there's a conflict. And in time, that conflict may cause you to rethink your affiliation with the group, especially if you have people outside the group who are, in a strategic sense, encouraging you to reevaluate, to think, to look at other perspectives. Disillusionment is also common. Yogi Berra famously said, the future ain't what it used to be. And what he means is your expectation of what the future would be like turns out to be false. When I was a little kid, by 2018, we should have been driving flying cars. I remember seeing magazine articles and stuff about the future. The movie 2001: A Space Odyssey was made, I think, in 1967. And at that time, it wasn't so outrageous to think by 2001 we'd have bases on the moon. Instead, we landed on the moon in 69 and the early 70s, and we haven't been back since. So that's really what Berra is referring to when he says the future ain't what it used to be. For cult members, they often experience very emotional, confident predictions about what's going to happen. We're going to save the world. I remember working with one young man who followed a would-be cult leader who was not a very successful cult leader because he was basically a decent human being, and he wasn't unethical enough to get people to obey him. So there really was a fair amount of autonomy that people kept. And they embarked on a 1-year quest to travel around the world, and they thought that they were going to create a movement, that would take the world by storm, and they would help the world to become a wonderful place. And instead, at the end of the year, the 3 or 4 people who went out came back alone. They were totally disillusioned. The group fell apart. It never got anywhere. Other groups may make claims, and then the group has to often use its collection of manipulative techniques to keep people believing. Like PM used to talk about if they had the square root of 1% of siddhas meditating, that all kinds of wonderful things would happen in the environment near it. They don't talk about the Maharishi effect anymore, Pat, right?
Well, no, they still talk about it, um, and they present research that indicates that it works. And the style of research that they use, I call painting the bullseye around the arrow, in meaning that when they get a group of people doing their advanced meditations together, then they look at statistics. And if accident rate goes down, they say that the reason the accident rate went down was because of the meditation group. If the next time there's a group of 500 people together, accident rate goes up, then they might notice that the stock market went up. So they'll say the stock market went up because of meditation. So they take credit for
Yeah, well,
everything.
that's the pseudoscience and the non-falsifiability component. But they don't put it as up front in their advertising like they used to 20,
Yeah,
25 years ago, right?
yeah, I think so.
You think so? I don't know
Yeah.
because I haven't seen it that much. In any event, if you as a TMer, if you looked into that and you saw the criticisms of that, it might cause you to question the group, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Um, and that's what can cause people to become disillusioned. And once they begin to question it, they may leave. Also, people discover that the leader has feet of clay. So they may discover that the leader is having sex with women in the group when he's supposed to be a celibate guru. This happens a lot. And that may be disillusioning to members and cause them to begin to reevaluate. Sometimes people feel guilty about how they treat other members in the group, and that they treat people as objects to be manipulated. And then they may have conflicts with the leader.
Hmm.
Some people are more aggressive questioners than others, and they may resist the leader trying to stifle their questioning. So there
The,
are a variety of things that can happen.
the other ones I want to bring up is people get bored uh, being in groups also. I mean, the
Yeah,
excitement can be gone,
yeah.
and and also that it can become just too difficult. It's just not worth it.
That's a good point. I should add that to this list here because that is an important point. Um, you know, yeah, I mean, for sure, that can be a factor.
Uh,
You
uh,
do the same thing. It's like a job. Sometimes you may love a job, but you do it long enough, and gradually it becomes routine, and you want to change.
so I have a couple other ones. Health reasons. Um,
Yeah,
and that's something that I've seen with many people in groups is that they get sick and it doesn't fit in with the group's ideas. And some people are shunned for those reasons. And also because of relationships. They may fall in love with somebody that is not part of the group, or they miss their family.
and
And those things.
sometimes that can hold people in a group. They
Yes.
get married in the group, and one spouse is questioning it and wants to leave, and the other is very devoted. Can be there are people who will stay in groups for many years, just so as not to tear their family apart. Okay, also an important factor is information can leak through even the hardest boundaries. Um, and this is why it's important if you have a loved one in a group to maintain contact and try to maintain enough of a relationship that you have communication at minimum because you never know what might cause someone to begin thinking. You never know what seeds you may even unintentionally or accidentally plant just through ordinary conversation with someone. Um, I mean, those of us who talk sometimes will have someone come and say, you said blah, 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 and that really had an impact on me. And I have no recollection of ever having said that. I said a lot of things in the course of the talk, but there was one thing that for that particular person was meaningful. And it might have been incidental to the talk I gave, but for that person, it sparked something. The same thing can happen for someone in a group. There may be some little bit of information or some experience they have with someone outside the group or even in the group that causes them to begin to think and to begin to question, at least privately. Also, former members who retain ties with existing members can be very important. Um, there are people, especially among SGAs, people born and raised in groups. Lois Kendall, who wrote the very fine book on, oh God, I can't think of titles anymore. It's in our bookstore. Um, she was in a fringe Christian group in England. She had, I think, 6 or 7 siblings, brothers and sisters. She was the first to leave. And over a period of about 20 years, I think she managed to get everyone except perhaps one of her siblings out of the group. Uh, it was a long, laborious slog for her to do that, but she did it. And she's not alone in that regard. Sometimes, the internet can can serve a useful purpose. There was this group, the Jim Roberts group. Roberts died several years ago. They were called the media because they were a wandering group that used to wander around the country, and they'd live in abandoned houses or camp out, and they'd sometimes look for food in dumpsters, which is how they got the name the garbage eaters. Well, Jim Roberts forbade them to have contact with families. Um, and the families, before the internet, got together and got organized, and they would have meetings once a year. And when the internet came, they developed a website, and they would put posts for their children, whom they may not have seen for 2, 3, 4, 5 years or more. And members of the Roberts group would sneak into libraries and go on the web. So there was a certain amount of rebellion and dissent within that group. They would not have told Jim Roberts to his face what they were doing because they would have been chastised. But they were doing it, and family members were able to develop some kind of communication, or at least the members who were going to the library and going on the internet were finding out things that they would not have known about in the group, if it weren't for the internet. The internet has also made it difficult for the big groups, about which there is a lot of bad publicity, to recruit people, because young kids will go to the internet and Google whatever the group's name is, and they'll find all the dirty laundry. And I think that's part of the reason
Mhm.
why most of the groups that come to our attention today are groups we never heard of. They're small groups, and they don't have any kind of internet profile to speak of. And another factor is that people will rationalize their involvement in a group. But as one woman put it, the shelf on which I had placed my rationalizations eventually collapsed. So if you're following a guru who is supposed to be God incarnate, and you find out that he's having sex with this woman and that woman, you might rationalize to yourself that, well, he's detached from sex. He's only doing it to help the women because he's so full of love. But when you find out that he's doing it with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 women, and you find out that women who leave the group begin to report it and express that they felt used and abused, it may be difficult to keep rationalizing the belief that this is a holy man who is one with God. And you might begin to entertain the possibility that he's a fraud. And that could cause kind of a pivotal shift that could cause someone to walk out of the group. When people come out, there's a whole range of recovery issues. The symptoms of depression, anxiety, floating, guilt, triggers, etc., very common. There's a sense of betrayal. How could something that I thought was so wonderful turn out to be so horrible? At least for those who join groups. For second generation, that sense of betrayal sometimes is directed at the parents because children expect their parents to protect them, but they don't realize that their parents are, in a sense, pawns of a larger force, so to speak. And when they come out of the group, they may have a sense of betrayal toward their parents because the parents did not protect them against the group leader or others in the group. Some people come out and with genuine trauma issues, which means that the severity of the abuse was great enough that you may actually have autonomous biological processes going on. And there's been a lot of speculation in mental health circles on the biological bases of trauma and how this may affect treatment. Donnie Whitsitt wrote about that a few years ago in our ICSA Today. Dealing with trauma is a little bit different from dealing with sort of the expression of trauma has an added dimension that requires an added type of treatment.
This talk about trauma, there's I don't know where it is on the site, Michael, but Donnie from the workshop, her PowerPoint on the neurobiology of trauma and healing is there, and it will be included in this upcoming series that we're going to be doing with Joe, Donnie, Rachel Bernstein, and myself for families. Will be there.
Here's how you could find that and other items. You go to the website, ICSA Publications, Index of ICSA Articles. Okay, we'll search. Find, where's find? Find.
Next to more.
Whitsitt. Okay, and we find 1 out of 8. And where is the first Whitsitt? Why cults are harmful, neurobiological speculation. I think that's where she may go into that.
And, and then there's a PowerPoint from the family workshop.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I have that.
I have it. I'll send it to you.
Well, people may want it. I mean, it's there, and also on trauma. Dan Shaw's book on traumatizing narcissism has been very well received, and he also speculates on the psychology of the cult leader, which people respond to. We have a video of his talk on that subject on the ICSA YouTube channel, which you can access at the bottom of every page in the website. Just click on YouTube, and it will take you to the YouTube channel. We've got about 50 videos on the channel now. Okay, so
as we're about 10 minutes from the end of this session. Yeah. There's been many questions that have not been answered that have come up. So I propose
this is my last slide. Let me just say, the identity change happens again, only your identity is changing from a pseudo-identity of dependency to independence, from obedience to choosing, from a closed system to an open system, from black and white thinking to gray nuanced thinking. That's an adjustment that people have to make when they come out.